All right, let's get right into it. Today, in this explainer, we're diving headfirst into Kathryn Stockett's highly anticipated 2026 novel, The Calamity Club. We're going to be focusing heavily on how she weaves together these deep, complex themes of systemic injustice with the incredible power of found family. If you follow the literary world at all, you know this release is a massive deal. So let's jump straight into the core of the story. And let me tell you, critics are absolutely raving about this book's unique mix. It blends this thick Southern Gothic atmosphere with really sharp, furious social commentary. I mean, the New York Times book review literally called it pure hell-raising entertainment. It's a massive, sweltering, 600-plus page beast of an epic set in 1930s Mississippi, and somehow it manages to be both a devastating critique of historical cruelty and, well, a darkly funny heist novel.
But honestly, the story of how this book came to be is almost as wild as the novel itself. Look at this timeline. There was a massive 17-year gap between her historic 2009 debut, The Help, and this new release. That is almost 2 decades filled with intense public scrutiny and massive cultural shifts, which actually led to a period of pretty severe creative paralysis for Stockett. She ended up relocating to Bali in 2019 to get some perspective, and then moved back to Mississippi right in the middle of the 2020 pandemic. That's when she finally just put her head down and finished this sprawling narrative.
Which brings us to the obvious, multi-million-dollar question. After 17 years, was it actually worth the wait? Well, let's find out. Let's dive right into the bleak historical realities and the unforgettable characters driving this thing, just to see exactly what she was building during all those years away.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, a system of injustice in 1930s Mississippi.
To really grasp what these characters are up against, you have to understand just how violently unequal the social order of the Great Depression actually was. The legal system, it was built entirely to protect the elite. Take the eugenics movement, for example. In 1928, an actual Mississippi law allowed the forced sterilization of anyone deemed feeble-minded. And in the novel, our primary antagonist, this ruthless orphanage director named Garnet Pittman, weaponizes this exact law. She uses it to forcibly sterilize and institutionalize a young mother named Charlie. And why? Literally just to cover up the fact that Garnet's own husband had an affair with Charlie when she was 17. It's absolutely brutal.
So you get this crazy double standard. The legal system perfectly protected wealthy abusers like Garnett, who use state power to keep their pristine reputations intact. But on the flip side, you have the moral reality for women pushed to the absolute brink. With zero legal protection and no money during the Depression, principled women like Birdie and Charlie are backed into a corner. They literally have to abandon everything society tells them is right, just to survive and protect the people they love.
Which brings us to Section 2. Forging a found family and unbreakable sisterhood.
Because when the system completely turns its back on you, what do? You find your own people. Society essentially threw these women in the trash. You've got Meg, an 11-year-old orphan labeled unadoptable, Birdie, an unmarried woman desperately trying to save her family's farm from foreclosure, Charlie, Meg's biological mother, who's been stripped of all her rights, and marginalized sex workers navigating an era that shut them out of any traditional work. They were all discarded, so they had absolutely no choice but to band together and form this fierce, unbreakable sisterhood.
And this is where things get wild. In a completely desperate act of rebellion, this found family comes up with an audacious plan. They create the Calamity Club, a secret underground brothel operating right out of the aristocratic Tart family mansion in Oxford. It is highly illegal, the stakes are off the charts, but it's literally their only shot at raising enough cash to save Birdie's farm and rescue Meg from that nightmare orphanage.
Moving on to Section 3, a messy, realistic resolution and winning the battle.
Now, with a heist-like setup like that, you're probably expecting a Hollywood ending, right? Bad guys go to jail, everyone lives happily ever after. But Stockett is writing historical fiction, not a fairy tale. So it forces us to ask this really tough question. Does saving one child actually dismantle a completely broken system? That right there is the thematic crux of the whole climax. It really challenges you to think about the limits of individual victories against state-sanctioned injustice. The ending is definitely bittersweet. On one hand, you get this massive personal victory. Charlie and Meg finally reunite, and they manage to escape to Memphis with the money. But on the other hand, the reality is that Garnet Pittman, the antagonist, stays in power. Sure, she gets humiliated, but she keeps total control of the orphanage. The oppressive institutions themselves, they remain entirely intact.
So the big takeaway here is that you can win the battle, but completely lose the war, and still somehow find hope. Stockett isn't pretending that one weekend of rebellion fixes the Great Depression, but she shows us that despite all that systemic cruelty, the sheer resilience of these discarded women organizing and fighting back is incredibly inspiring.
And finally, Section 4, the critical consensus, and if it was worth the wait.
So, with all these heavy themes, eugenics, institutional abuse, survival sex work, how did the literary world actually react? Well, they loved it. Reviewers universally celebrated how the novel turned dark history into a totally engaging ride. The Sunday Times called it a tale of complex sisterhood and tested moral compasses. It's honestly a huge testament to her skill as a writer that a book dealing with such bleak reality is consistently described as a thrilling adventure.
And how exactly does she pull that off without it being totally depressing? Critics point to her signature balance of heartbreak and sharp, caustic humor. It's wild. You'll be sitting with a character's raw, devastating vulnerability one minute, and literally in the next paragraph, you're laughing out loud at some perfectly observed social disaster among the Southern elite. That tonal tightrope is what makes those 600 pages just fly by.
Oprah Daily really hit the nail on the head here. They called it so immersive, exciting, and downright fabulous you never want it to end. The consensus across the board is that her 17-year labor didn't just result in an okay follow-up, it resulted in a masterfully drawn, huge commercial hit that is deeply resonating with readers everywhere.
Just to give you the quick rundown, it was named a most anticipated book by almost everyone. New York Times, Oprah, Goodreads. It's been universally hailed as compulsively readable. Now, actually, sure, a few critics did note that the pacing dips just a tiny bit in the middle during the brothel buildup, but the overwhelming verdict, this book is an unforgettable, beautifully narrated epic that was absolutely worth the wait.
So let's wrap this explainer up with a final thought for you. Are you ready to join the Calamity Club? Are you going to dive into this fierce, funny, and heartbreaking testament to underestimated women who refuse to be thrown away? It's an amazing piece of historical fiction that really makes you look differently at the systems around us. I highly recommend checking it out. Thanks for hanging out with me to explore this one, and as always, keep learning.